Hey everyone! Tonight we're going to dive into the story of a lake that has always been more than just water. Lake Titicaca rests high in the Andes, over 12,000 feet above sea level, straddling the border between Peru and Bolivia. From a distance it looks calm, a vast mirror of deep blue set against mountains that touch the sky. But for centuries people have looked at its waters and seen something much more than a body of water. They've seen a cradle of gods, a place where worlds began, and perhaps even where civilizations were lost. Standing at its edge, you can feel why. The air is thin and sharp, the kind that makes every breath deliberate. The horizon stretches wide, the lake seeming to dissolve into the heavens. In that space, it's not hard to imagine why ancient peoples thought of this as a threshold, not just between countries, but between Earth and something greater. Before we go on, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you stood by a place like this with legends of lost temples and ancient gods, would you feel wonder, or maybe a little unease? Drop a comment and let's see how many of us would want to look deeper beneath those waters. In Andean tradition, this is where the sun itself was born. The story says that long ago, before time was measured, the world was covered in darkness. Out of the waters rose Viracocha, the great creator god. From Lake Titicaca, he began shaping the earth, calling forth the sun, the moon and the stars. He carved valleys, lifted mountains and breathed life into the first people. The lake then was not just water, it was the origin point of light and order. Different communities told their stories in their own ways, but almost all of them returned to the lake. The Incas, who would go on to build one of the most remarkable empires in the world, looked to Titicaca as sacred ground. They believed their first rulers, Manco Capac and Mama Oclo, emerged from the lake, sent by the sun god Inti to bring knowledge and order to humanity. The shoreline was dotted with shrines, pilgrimage routes, and sacred islands where ceremonies were held. One of the most important is the Isla del Sol, the island of the sun. Even today, ruins stand there, stone terraces, ritual platforms, and sacred sites where people gathered to honour the birth of the sun. Pilgrims once crossed the lake in reed boats, carrying offerings to the temples. The journey itself was part of the ritual, as though crossing those waters meant stepping closer to the divine. But legends don't stop at the surface. For as long as people have lived around Titicaca, there have been whispers of things beneath it. Some say entire cities lie hidden below, their temples drowned, their roads now paths for fish. Others speak of golden idols resting on the lakebed, offerings that slipped into the water during rituals. Fishermen tell stories of glimpsing walls through the clear shallows, stones too straight to be natural. When storms whip across the lake and waves crash, some say you can hear echoes of bells ringing from churches that no longer stand on land. It's easy to dismiss stories like that as just folklore, but they have persisted for centuries. And in cultures where myth and history are often intertwined, the line between legend and memory is not always as clear as we'd like to think. Could it be that these stories of submerged temples and lost cities are more than imagination? Could they be fragments of something real, passed down through generations in the language of myth? Lake Titicaca itself seems to invite such wonder. It is the highest navigable lake in the world, its surface so vast it feels more like an inland sea. The climate around it is unpredictable. Clear skies can turn to storms in minutes. Archaeologists studying the region have noted how water levels have shifted dramatically over thousands of years. Entire shorelines bear the marks of ancient beaches, now stranded high above today's waters. That raises a haunting possibility. Perhaps the ruins people whisper about are not just stories, but places that once stood on dry land before the lake rose to swallow them. Even the landscape hints at an ancient relationship between land and water. Just a short distance from the lake is Tiwanaku, one of the great pre-Inca civilizations. Its colossal stone monuments and finely carved blocks seem almost to point back toward Titicaca. For the people of Tiwanaku, the lake was a living presence, a sacred mirror of the cosmos. In their art you find symbols of fish, waves, and aquatic deities, signs that the waters were as central to their spiritual world as the sky above. The Incas too wove the lake into their empire's spiritual map. They established pilgrimage routes that stretched hundreds of miles, with Titicaca as a final destination. To arrive at its shores was to reach a place where earth and heaven touched. Some of the offerings they left behind have been found on islands. Ceramics painted with intricate designs, gold ornaments shaped like llamas or birds, even carved stone boxes filled with miniature treasures. These objects remind us that for the people of the Andes, giving something to the lake was not losing it, but placing it into the hands of the divine. And then there are the stories of Viracocha's floods. Some Andean myths tell of a time when the god grew angry with the world he had created. He sent waters to cover the land, wiping out entire peoples so he could begin again. The idea of civilizations drowned underwater is not unique to the Andes. It appears in cultures across the globe, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica. But here, with a lake so immense and so ancient, the story feels especially tied to place. When people looked at Titicaca, they saw not just a lake but a reminder. Water can give life, and it can also take it away. Today, when you stand on the shores of Titicaca, you're standing in the middle of this tangle of history and myth. The lake reflects clouds and mountains, but it also reflects centuries of human imagination. People still come to its islands to leave offerings. Tourists ride boats built from reeds, the same way ancient pilgrims once did. And beneath it all, the old whispers continue, of temples, of roads, of civilizations that might still rest below the surface. Whether those whispers hold truth is a question that has drawn explorers, divers and archaeologists again and again. But even before we dive into what has been found beneath the water, it's worth pausing to feel the weight of the stories themselves. For the people who lived by this lake, it wasn't just a setting for myths. It was the axis of their world, the place where creation began and where mysteries still linger. And that leaves us with the question that hangs in the thin Andean air. When myths speak of temples beneath the lake, are they speaking in symbols or in memories? By the middle of the 20th century, the myths of Lake Titicaca had already captured the imagination of scholars and explorers. But stories are one thing, evidence is another. For generations, fishermen had claimed they could see stone walls under the clear waters on calm days, lines too regular to be natural. Some told of pulling up ancient-looking ceramics in their nets, or of finding idols that seemed out of place in the mud. To most outsiders, these tales sounded like folklore, the kind of thing people invent around a lake with so much mystery attached to it. Yet those whispers persisted, and in time they began to reach curious ears beyond the Andes. In the 1960s, diving technology was advancing, and interest in underwater archaeology was growing. Rumours of submerged ruins at Titicaca started to circulate more widely, sometimes in newspapers, sometimes in travel accounts from adventurers who had spoken to locals. These weren't claims of vague, lost cities like Atlantis. They were precise: walls, terraces, even roads that seemed to vanish beneath the water. The lake itself was vast and often murky, but on clear mornings, locals swore you could look down and glimpse the outlines of something built, not born. Among those intrigued was Jacques Cousteau, already a household name for his expeditions beneath the seas. In the early 1970s, Cousteau brought a team to Lake Titicaca to see if the legends held any weight. It was a bold move. Diving at such high altitude is no simple feat. The air is thin, the pressure on the body greater than at sea level, and the cold of the Andean water is bone deep. For Cousteau and his crew, it was an entirely different world from the tropical reefs they were used to exploring. They plunged into the lake with cameras and equipment, hoping to reveal what lay beneath. What they found was both fascinating and frustrating. On one hand, they didn't discover the grand submerged temples or cities that the legends promised. The images they brought back didn't show towering ruins or massive structures. But Cousteau did note something unusual. In some areas, the lakebed seemed to reveal formations that didn't look entirely natural. He spoke of something down there, though what exactly he left open to interpretation. For skeptics, this was proof that the stories were overblown. For believers, Cousteau's words were tantalizing. If a man known for his cautious scientific approach hinted at mysteries, maybe there was more to the legends than he was able to capture. Cousteau himself seemed struck by the feeling of the place, describing the lake as haunting, with an atmosphere unlike anywhere else he had explored. Meanwhile, the local communities held to their own knowledge. Fishermen and farmers around Titicaca never needed Cousteau to tell them the waters hid secrets. They had seen artifacts pulled from the depths with their own hands. Small idols of stone or gold sometimes surfaced, carried up by nets or found washed ashore after storms. Some were kept as treasures, others offered quietly to shrines. For the Aymara and Quechua peoples, these weren't mysteries to debate. They were continuations of a sacred relationship with the lake. Through the following decades, amateur divers, journalists, and a few researchers continued to investigate the lake. The challenges were immense. Visibility was poor, temperatures were punishing, and funding for systematic study was scarce. Yet reports continued to trickle in. Photographs of what looked like cut stones, accounts of terraces descending into the water, descriptions of submerged pathways. Each glimpse added weight to the possibility that beneath the shimmering surface, the lake was guarding memories of a time long past. It wasn't until the turn of the new millennium that those whispers began to solidify into something undeniable. In the year 2000, a joint expedition between Bolivian archaeologists and Italian researchers set out with more advanced technology and a clear goal: to survey parts of the lakebed systematically. They weren't just adventurers chasing legends, they were scientists, equipped with sonar, mapping tools, and professional divers ready to document whatever they found. What they uncovered stunned even the cautious. On the lakebed, hidden beneath layers of silt, the team discovered the unmistakable remains of human construction. Stone terraces stretched across the underwater landscape, carefully built to hold back soil or to shape farmland just as they did on dry land. These weren't random piles of rocks. They followed patterns, the kind of geometric order that only human hands create. Divers traced the lines with their fingers, the stones still fitted together after centuries below water. Then came something even more remarkable, a massive structure that appeared to be the foundation of a temple. The scale was enormous, with blocks arranged in ways that recalled the great monuments of the Andes. Measuring roughly 200 meters long, this submerged temple hinted at a place of ceremony, not just ordinary habitation. Around it, the divers noted walls and possible roads, as though they were drifting over the remains of a planned living complex. Artifacts confirmed it wasn't imagination. Divers brought up ceramics decorated with patterns, idols carved from stone, and even gold objects, small but finely crafted. These weren't accidental deposits. They looked like offerings, items deliberately placed in the water as gifts to the gods. Some objects matched known styles of pre-Inca cultures, while others seemed distinct, suggesting the site had a history that stretched across different periods. News of the discovery spread quickly. For centuries, locals had told stories of ruins under the water, and now there was evidence that they were right. Archaeologists and historians debated what this meant. Some argued the structures could be Tiwanaku in origin, since their great city stood only a dozen miles from the shore. Others suggested they might predate even that, perhaps the remains of an earlier culture, whose memory lived on in myth. The expedition's findings raised as many questions as answers. How old were these constructions? How did they end up underwater? Were they built on land that was later flooded, or had they always been intended for a setting where water played a role? And perhaps most intriguingly, if this was only what could be found in one surveyed area, what else might be waiting, still hidden in the lake's depths? Local communities received the news with a mixture of pride and reverence. For them, the discoveries weren't simply archaeological curiosities, they were validation of stories told for generations. To hear that foreign divers had found temples and offerings beneath the lake was not surprising. It was confirmation of what elders had said all along. The lake had always been sacred. Now, science was catching up to the memory of the people who lived beside it. For outsiders, though, the implications felt staggering. The Andes are already home to some of the world's greatest mysteries, from the Nazca Lines to the stone enigmas of Sacsayhuaman and Machu Picchu. Adding an entire submerged temple complex to that list deepened the sense that this part of the world held chapters of human history still unread. It made archaeologists wonder, if one lake could hide a temple the size of a football field, what other treasures might lie out of reach, not only here but across the globe? Of course, not everything was made public. Some of the artifacts were quietly removed for study, their details only sparingly released. Photos circulated, but many of the images from the expedition remained locked away in academic archives. That partial silence left room for speculation, even suspicion. Why not share everything? Was it a matter of protecting the site, or of controlling a narrative about the age and origin of what had been found? Even without full disclosure, the discoveries marked a turning point. The myths of Lake Titicaca had always suggested that the waters hid more than fish and reeds. Now there was proof: terraces, roads, offerings, and a massive temple. Taken together, they pointed toward a sophisticated culture, one capable of monumental architecture, ceremonial traditions, and a deep relationship with the sacred. And strikingly, much of this seemed to predate the Inca Empire. The Incas, after all, arrived relatively late in the story of the Andes. By the time they rose to power in the 15th century, civilizations had already been flourishing around Lake Titicaca for over 1,000 years. The ruins at the bottom of the lake suggested that those earlier cultures had built more than we ever realized, and that some of their most sacred places may now rest where few eyes can reach them. So when we think back to Cousteau, drifting through the cold depths and speaking of something unusual, it's hard not to smile. He was right. The lake does hold secrets. They may not be the sprawling Atlantis-like cities of legend, but they are no less remarkable. Beneath those waters lies a record of human devotion and ingenuity, preserved not in stone walls standing on mountain ridges, but in the quiet silt of a sacred lake. And as divers surfaced in the year 2000, cradling artifacts that hadn't been touched in centuries, one truth became clear. The stories told by fishermen and elders were never just stories. They were echoes of memory, carried forward until the day the lake itself revealed that it had been keeping watch over temples and offerings all along. When the first temple stones and carved idols were lifted from the waters of Lake Titicaca, one question immediately surfaced alongside them: who built all this? The Incas were quick to claim the lake as their sacred origin, but even they admitted the ruins nearby belonged to peoples far older. Across the Andes, the Incas often pointed to ancient structures and said they were inherited, not created by their own hands. To understand the sunken temples, then, we have to look further back in time, beyond the empire most people know, to the civilizations that came before. The most prominent of these was Tiwanaku, a culture that flourished between about 400 and 1000 AD. Its capital city, also called Tiwanaku, lies only 12 miles from Lake Titicaca, close enough to be touched by the same winds that ripple its waters. Even in ruin, the site speaks of vision and power. Immense stone blocks lie scattered across the ground, some weighing dozens of tons, carved with a precision that still puzzles modern builders. The Gate of the Sun, a single slab of andesite carved into a monumental arch, shows the face of a radiant deity, flanked by winged figures part human and part animal. The Tiwanaku people were more than stonemasons. They were sky watchers and agricultural innovators. Their city aligned with solstices and equinoxes, its structures acting like instruments to track the heavens. Around the lake they built waru-waru, or raised fields separated by water channels. These ingenious beds kept crops safe from frost and reflected starlight and moonlight, blending farming with cosmic rhythms. To walk through Tiwanaku today is to glimpse a civilization that saw no separation between earth and sky. It's not hard to imagine, then, that the submerged ruins beneath Lake Titicaca might belong to the same culture. The terraces described by divers look strikingly similar to the agricultural systems Tiwanaku built on land. The ceremonial platforms underwater echo the massive foundations that still stand at the ancient city itself. Both suggest a people who treated survival and the sacred as parts of the same design. Yet there are puzzles. The objects retrieved from the lake don't all match Tiwanaku's style. Some clearly reflect their influence, but others seem older, cruder, as though they belong to an earlier presence along the shore. This raises the possibility that the Sunken temple complex began before Tiwanaku reached its height, later absorbed into their religious world. Or perhaps it points to a parallel culture, one that lived beside them and shared the same reverence for the waters. Tiwanaku did not emerge from nowhere. For centuries before, smaller communities had settled around the lake. Pottery fragments and stone tools trace their presence back to about 1500 BC. These groups built villages, farmed the high plains, and developed cosmologies centered on Titicaca. Tiwanaku may have inherited their knowledge, refined their techniques, and transformed their rituals into monumental architecture. If so, then the ruins below the water could reach far deeper into time than the city that later dominated the region. The bond between the city and the lake is woven into Andean myth. One legend tells that the creator god Viracocha rose from Titicaca's waters and walked to Tiwanaku, where he breathed life into stone figures that became the first humans. In this telling, the lake and the city are inseparable, one the birthplace of divinity, the other the workshop where humanity was shaped. Perhaps the submerged shrines were part of this sacred geography, stations along a mythic journey linking water and land. What we know of Tiwanaku also reveals a culture that reached far beyond its borders. At its peak, the city was a hub of exchange, pulling goods and ideas from distant lands. Excavations have uncovered seashells from the Pacific coast, feathers from the Amazon, and minerals from remote mountains. If pilgrims came from across the Andes to visit the city, it makes sense they might also travel to the lake, leaving offerings at temples that stood on its shores or within its waters. The gold ornaments, ceramic incense burners, and carved boxes found by divers could well be the echoes of that wide cultural network. Some voices, however, urge caution. Stones resting on a lakebed can play tricks on the eye, and water can move objects in ways that mimic deliberate placement. But the sheer size of the underwater temple mapped by divers, about 200 meters long, is difficult to explain away as accident. Set against Tiwanaku's proven ability to move and shape massive stones, the case for human construction becomes stronger. If the builders were indeed Tiwanaku, what purpose did the drowned complex serve? Was it a ceremonial centre for worship of water deities, a site for pilgrimages where offerings were cast into the depths, or perhaps even a settlement swallowed by rising waters? Each possibility opens another layer of meaning, and none can be dismissed outright. What's striking is how the people of this region viewed the lake itself. Today we often see a body of water as a border, something to cross or to measure against land. For those ancient cultures, Titicaca was the centre, the axis of their world. Temples, terraces, and offerings radiated outward from it, as though everything in their lives depended on maintaining a relationship with the sacred waters. The ruins beneath the lake, then, are not isolated curiosities. They are part of a continuum, a thread that runs from the earlier settlements along its shores to the grandeur of Tiwanaku, and later to the Inca Empire. Each generation added its own layer of stone and myth, weaving their lives into the same sacred landscape. The submerged temples are fragments of that story, reminders that the lake was never just a setting. It was the heart of a civilization. If Tiwanaku was indeed connected to the temples beneath Lake Titicaca, it raises a fascinating thought. What if the submerged ruins weren't just extensions of the city, but part of a broader sacred network, a landscape designed to bind heaven, earth, and water into one? The Andes are full of places where architecture mirrors the sky. Machu Picchu aligns with solstices. The Nazca lines stretch across desert plains in the shapes of animals visible only from above, and Tiwanaku itself points to the movements of the sun. In this context, temples underwater may not be as strange as they seem. They could have been intentional, built to honour a relationship with the lake that defined the people who lived there. Some scholars have suggested that the underwater terraces could have been agricultural experiments, perhaps even ceremonial gardens where crops were grown close to the lake. Others wonder whether the vast temple foundation was designed for rituals tied directly to water, fertility ceremonies, prayers for rain, or offerings to deities believed to dwell below the surface. For cultures that saw lakes and rivers as portals to other realms, building within or near the water may have carried profound symbolic meaning. One reason Tiwanaku stands out is the sophistication of its stonework. Blocks weighing many tons were cut and fitted so precisely that even today a knife blade cannot slip between them. At Pumapunku, a site just outside the main city, huge H-shaped blocks lie scattered as if toppled by some immense force. Their interlocking joints and clean lines look almost modern, as though they were shaped by machines rather than chisels. This same level of engineering skill might explain the underwater constructions. If Tiwanaku could accomplish such feats on land, why not at the lake's edge, or even within its shallows, later swallowed by rising waters? Yet the picture isn't so simple. Radiocarbon dating and stylistic analysis suggest that some of the artifacts from the lake are older than Tiwanaku's peak. This hints at something deeper, that the sunken temples might belong to an earlier chapter, one that Tiwanaku inherited or repurposed. Cultures often build atop the ruins of those who came before, layering their own meanings onto stones already considered sacred. Perhaps Tiwanaku found ancient shrines along the lake, expanded them, and wove them into their cosmology, just as the Incas later absorbed Tiwanaku itself. This idea is reinforced by the fact that the Andean world was never static. The region around Titicaca was home to a mosaic of cultures long before the Incas arrived. Some were small villages, others regional powers that rose and fell over centuries. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of distinct ceramic styles, burial practices, and architectural techniques scattered around the lake's shores, each pointing to different communities with their own traditions. In such a dynamic setting, the sunken temples could easily represent multiple layers of human history, not a single moment frozen in time. What makes Tiwanaku especially compelling, though, is how it bridges myth and material. For local peoples, the city wasn't just a political centre, but a spiritual axis. Pilgrims likely travelled from across the Andes to experience its monuments, bringing offerings that connected their own homelands to this sacred hub. If those pilgrims continued their journeys to Lake Titicaca, casting treasures into its depths, the underwater discoveries might represent not only Tiwanaku's own culture, but a tapestry of influences woven together by devotion to the lake. The Incas themselves seemed to sense this continuity. When they expanded their empire centuries later, they treated Tiwanaku with reverence, visiting its ruins and incorporating its deities into their own pantheon. They declared Lake Titicaca the birthplace of the sun, reinforcing myths that tied their own rulers to the sacred waters. To them, the lake wasn't just a resource or a boundary, it was a living memory, carrying the weight of cultures that had risen and fallen before their time. In this light, the sunken temples become more than just archaeological puzzles. They are symbols of endurance, places where belief and stone converged in ways that still resonate. To imagine Tiwanaku priests standing at the lake's edge, gazing into waters that mirrored the stars, is to understand how the people of the Andes saw their world. They weren't merely building for survival, they were building to connect, to align themselves with the forces of creation they believed flowed through the land. Of course, much remains uncertain. Without full-scale excavation, an effort hampered by the lake's depth, its cold, and its vastness, we may never know whether the submerged complex was purely Tiwanaku, entirely older, or a blend of both. But uncertainty is part of what makes the mystery so powerful. It keeps the lake alive as a place of questions, not just answers. Every artifact brought up from the depths adds a fragment to the story, but never the whole picture. And maybe that's fitting. Lake Titicaca has always been more than a place on a map. For the cultures that grew around it, it was the centre of the world, a mirror of the cosmos, a threshold between this life and the next. The temples beneath its surface are simply another expression of that truth. They remind us that human beings have always sought to anchor the invisible in stone, to give shape to the unseen. Whether built by Tiwanaku or by cultures older still, they remain testaments to a vision of life that placed the sacred not in distant heavens, but in the waters lapping at the edge of home. For as long as people have told stories about Lake Titicaca, water has been both giver and taker. Myths remember floods sent by angry gods, while legends speak of temples and cities swallowed by the lake. What makes those stories haunting is that they echo patterns written into the land itself. Scientists studying the region have found that Titicaca's waters have never been fixed in place. Over thousands of years, the level of the lake has risen and fallen dramatically, sometimes turning valleys into seabeds, other times leaving former shorelines stranded high above the present waves. Walk along certain ridges, and you'll find terraces that once touched the water's edge, but now sit hundreds of feet above it. Some of these ancient beaches are marked by layers of shells, proof that they once lay beneath the surface. To stand there, looking down on the vast blue expanse, is to realize that what we call the lake has always been shifting. In this landscape, the idea of temples being swallowed by water is not just legend, it is entirely possible. Geologists have traced these changes through sediment cores pulled from the lakebed. By studying layers of mud and fossilized pollen, they can reconstruct ancient climates. What they've found is a history of extremes. There were times when Titicaca nearly dried out, shrinking to a fraction of its modern size. At other times, it surged higher, spilling into surrounding basins and creating temporary inland seas. These swings often coincided with dramatic shifts in rainfall, driven by changes in global climate patterns. For people living along its shores, such events would have been catastrophic. Villages could be abandoned, farmland drowned, and sacred sites lost beneath the rising tide. Andean myths seem to remember these upheavals. One story tells of Viracocha sending a great flood to destroy an earlier race of giants, sparing only a few who hid in caves. Another speaks of waves rising so high they swallowed entire peoples, forcing survivors to repopulate the world. To modern ears, these sound like allegories, but they may also be folk memories of real floods. When oral traditions persist across centuries, they often carry echoes of events that left deep marks on communities. Earthquakes too are woven into the story. The Andes are one of the most seismically active regions on Earth, born of tectonic plates colliding. Temples along the shores may have crumbled under tremors, their stones sliding into the water. Some researchers have suggested that sudden collapses could explain why large blocks rest on the lakebed, far from where they might once have stood. Imagine priests performing rituals on a terrace, only for the ground to quake and the structure to vanish into the depths. In such moments, myth and geology intertwine, each offering its own explanation for catastrophe. When divers in the modern era reported finding terraces, roads, and a massive temple foundation beneath the lake, the possibility of submersion became harder to ignore. Were these complexes originally built on dry ground, later drowned by rising waters? The evidence points in that direction. The temple foundation discovered in 2000, sites at a depth suggesting it was once above the waterline. If so, its builders may have stood on solid earth, never imagining their work would one day vanish beneath waves. This is not unique to the Andes. Across the world, we find echoes of lost landscapes swallowed by changing seas. In India's Gulf of Kambat, sonar surveys revealed the outlines of what may be ancient structures beneath the waves. Off the coast of Japan, the site of Yonaguni displays terraces and steps now claimed by the ocean. In the Mediterranean, whole harbours built by the Romans lie underwater, shifted by earthquakes and rising tides. Lake Titicaca belongs to this wider pattern, a reminder that water has always been reshaping the places humans call sacred. What sets Titicaca apart is the combination of myth and evidence. The stories of Viracocha's floods line up with the geological record of dramatic rises in lake levels. The offerings found by divers, gold ornaments, carved stone boxes, ceramic incense burners, may have been cast into temples that stood on dry land, later drowned, or placed deliberately as the waters encroached, an attempt to appease the forces rising around them. In either case, the lake holds not just artifacts but the memory of catastrophe. For the peoples who lived here, such disasters would not have been random misfortunes. In their worldview, floods and quakes carried meaning, signs of divine displeasure or cosmic renewal. To lose a temple beneath water might have been understood not as destruction but as transformation. The gods had reclaimed what humans had built, drawing it back into the womb of the lake. That perspective makes the submerged ruins more than accidents of geology. They are sacred losses, reminders that in the Andes the boundary between creation and destruction has always been thin. If rising waters and earthquakes shaped the fate of temples, it's worth asking how quickly these events might have unfolded. Some geologists suggest that the most dramatic changes in Lake Titicaca's level happened over centuries, a slow creep of water that gave communities time to adapt. Villages could move uphill, terraces could be rebuilt, shrines could be rededicated. But there may also have been sudden pulses, storms that swelled the lake in a single season, or seismic shifts that tilted shorelines overnight. For those who lived along its edge, the distinction between gradual and sudden change would have mattered little. Either way, sacred ground could disappear in a lifetime. Archaeological evidence hints that people did not abandon these places lightly. Offerings recovered from the lakebed suggest a ritual response to rising waters. Gold ornaments, finely worked and valuable, were not discarded carelessly. Ceramic vessels designed for burning incense were lowered into the water with intention. To give such treasures to the depths might have been an act of desperation, a plea to the gods to hold back the flood. It is not hard to imagine priests standing at the shoreline, casting objects into the encroaching water as chants echoed over the waves. Such images resonate with global traditions of flood stories. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh describes a deluge sent by the gods, with only a chosen survivor carrying the seed of life into the future. In the Hebrew Bible, Noah's Ark rides out waters that cover the earth. In Mesoamerica, the Maya told of worlds destroyed by floods before the present one was born. And in the Andes, Viracocha's flood destroyed an earlier race, clearing the way for new peoples. Across cultures, water serves as both destroyer and purifier, wiping clean the slate of history. Lake Titicaca's drowned ruins may be part of that same shared human memory, rooted in real experiences of catastrophe transformed into myth. Even the Inca, who came long after Tiwanaku, seemed to inherit this awareness. They treated the lake as the birthplace of the sun, but they also spoke of earlier peoples swept away by floods. The temples on the Isla del Sol and Isla de la Luna were not simply built to honor creation. They were reminders of cycles of destruction and renewal. For the Inca, as for those before them, the lake embodied both origin and end. Modern science has added weight to these stories. Sediment studies reveal sudden deposits of coarse material washed into the lake by massive floods. Ancient shorelines etched high above the present waterline tell of times when the lake was hundreds of feet deeper. In one period, perhaps around 2,000 years ago, water levels appear to have risen sharply, enough to engulf low-lying settlements. If the temple mapped by divers truly belongs to this time, it may have been a casualty of such an event. The possibility of earthquake-triggered submersion is equally compelling. The Andes are part of the Pacific Ring of Fire, where tectonic plates grind and buckle. A strong quake could have caused land near the shore to slump, dropping entire structures into deeper water. The disordered stones found on parts of the lakebed might testify to such collapses. Oral traditions remembering the earth shaking before floods may preserve echoes of these events. To people living then, such catastrophes would have been understood through the lens of divine will. A temple drowned by water was not simply destroyed, it was claimed. The lake, already seen as the birthplace of gods, had the power to take back what humans built. Perhaps this is why offerings continued even after submersion. Divers report finding artifacts resting directly on sunken platforms, as though rituals never ceased, only shifted into the water itself. The faithful may have paddled reed boats over submerged sanctuaries, casting gifts into the ripples above holy ground. This blending of disaster and devotion is part of what makes Titicaca's story so rich. It's not just a tale of ruins lost by accident of geology. It's about how people interpreted loss, how they wove catastrophe into their spiritual worldview. Rather than abandon their sacred sites, they adapted, turning destruction into a new form of worship. That resilience echoes across the Andes, where earthquakes and floods were constant reminders of life lived on fragile ground. When we place these events alongside other flood legends, the parallels are striking. Cultures separated by oceans and continents tell of gods sending waters to wipe the earth clean, of survivors rebuilding, of temples drowned. Some see in this a shared archetype of human psychology, our deep fear of water's destructive force. Others wonder whether such stories might point to a more connected history, a memory of global shifts at the end of the Ice Age, when melting glaciers sent seas rising worldwide. Whatever the explanation, Lake Titicaca fits squarely within this broader human pattern, a sacred landscape where myth and geology speak the same language. Today, when divers descend into the cold depths and trace their hands over stones cut by ancient masons, they're not just touching architecture, they are brushing against the consequences of catastrophe, the moment when human ambition met the force of nature and nature won. Yet even in that loss, meaning endured. The submerged temples remind us that the people of the Andes saw destruction not as final, but as part of a cycle, a chance for renewal, a command to adapt. And perhaps that is why the stories have never faded. From Viracocha's floods to fishermen's whispers of walls beneath the water, the memory of submersion lives on. The lake itself seems to carry it, its surface calm yet concealing, its depths holding both stone and story. Beneath those ripples lies the record of catastrophes that reshaped not only the land, but the imagination of everyone who has ever lived by its shore. When divers began to recover artifacts from the floor of Lake Titicaca, what emerged was not just architecture but ritual. The stones spoke of construction, but the objects placed among them revealed devotion. It was clear that the lake had been more than a backdrop to daily life. It was a stage for ceremony, a place where people brought their finest treasures not to keep but to give away. Some of the earliest finds were small but telling: ceramic vessels decorated with intricate designs, incense burners blackened by fire, and carved stone boxes designed to hold offerings. These objects were not lost by accident. They were lowered into the water deliberately, each carrying prayers into the depths. To cast gold, incense, or fine pottery into a lake that already demanded respect was a way of showing that no price was too high to maintain harmony with the divine. The objects retrieved span a remarkable range. Divers reported gold jewellery shaped into the likeness of llamas, animals central to Andean life both as pack carriers and as symbols of wealth. There were tiny figurines carved from stone, some depicting humans, others bearing hybrid traits, as though they represented beings who crossed the line between mortal and god. A few artifacts seemed designed to accompany offerings rather than serve practical use. Miniature tools, symbolic vessels, tokens that carried meaning far beyond their size. What's striking is that many of these artifacts mirror traditions found at Tiwanaku. At that ancient city, excavations have uncovered similar figurines and ceremonial items, often placed in caches near temples. The parallel suggests that rituals at the lake may have been extensions of the same worldview, binding the city and the water into one sacred system. Yet the finds from the lake also include items that seem foreign. Some ceramics show styles more typical of the Amazon basin. Certain ornaments resemble coastal traditions, far from the highlands. This suggests that pilgrims from across the region may have come to Titicaca, bringing offerings from their homelands to leave in its waters. Imagine what that means. A person travelling hundreds of miles carrying a small gold idol or a finely painted pot, not to display in their home but to consign forever to the depths of a distant lake. To do so was to weave their own community into the fabric of something larger, to acknowledge that Titicaca was not just local but pan-Andean in its significance. The lake became a crossroads of belief, a place where cultures converged, each adding their own thread to the tapestry of offerings. And the lake seemed to welcome it. Divers spoke of finding concentrations of artifacts in certain areas, as though particular spots on the lakebed served as underwater shrines. These clusters suggest intentionality, places chosen for their sacred value, where offerings accumulated over centuries. Some of the stone platforms beneath the water may have been designed specifically to receive such gifts, acting as tables on which the living could present treasures to unseen deities below. Not all finds have been shared openly. Reports mention larger statues glimpsed by divers, figures too massive to bring to the surface without heavy equipment. Some describe sunken roads, paved with stones, leading into deeper water. Others hint at megalithic blocks lying in arrangements that don't match natural geology. These accounts are tantalizing because they suggest that what has been officially documented may be only a fraction of what lies below. When expeditions publish carefully curated photos of small artifacts but remain silent about larger discoveries, speculation naturally follows. Are there monumental statues resting in the mud, unseen by the public? Are there temples more complete than the one mapped in 2000, hidden in parts of the lake no expedition has yet explored? What we do know is already astonishing. The combination of fine artifacts and monumental stonework paints a picture of a culture deeply invested in Titicaca as a sacred centre. The lake was not simply admired from its shores. It was engaged with directly, its waters treated as a medium through which offerings could reach the divine. The finds remind us that the people of the Andes did not separate the natural from the spiritual. A lake was not just water, it was a living presence, a participant in the covenant between humans and gods. And in a way, the offerings continue that covenant even now. Each artifact lifted from the depths is more than an object. It is the material echo of a prayer whispered centuries ago, a moment when someone stood at the water's edge and chose to give away something precious. The fact that these items still rest in the mud, untouched for so long, makes them feel like messages in a bottle, preserved until modern hands could read them. Among the most evocative discoveries are the carved stone boxes, often found sealed, their contents intact after centuries underwater. Some contained small figurines, others miniature vessels, and in rare cases, tiny gold ornaments. The idea of placing sacred items inside containers before lowering them into the lake suggests an intention to preserve meaning, as though the act of enclosure made the offering more potent. It is tempting to see these as messages to the gods, carefully packaged and sent into the depths where humans could no longer touch them. Other finds point to fire as part of ritual. Incense burners, their surfaces still blackened, seem almost out of place on the cold lakebed. But they tell a story. Ceremonies may have been held on rafts or platforms over the water, where incense was burned before the glowing vessels were tipped into the lake. The contrast between flame and water, smoke rising as an object sank, must have been powerful to witness. It suggests a ritual choreography where earth, air, fire and water were all called upon in balance. What fascinates researchers is the diversity of cultural fingerprints left in these offerings. Some ceramic fragments bear designs linked to Amazonian traditions, with stylized jungle animals painted in bright colours. Others reflect coastal motifs, recalling societies that lived far from the highlands. This mixture supports the idea that Titicaca was more than a local shrine. It was a pilgrimage centre, a place that drew people from distant valleys, jungles and deserts. Each left behind not only their presence, but a piece of their cultural identity, embedding the lake with layers of meaning that went beyond any single community. There are even hints of connections stretching farther than the Andes. Certain metallurgical styles, for instance, suggest knowledge of techniques more typical of northern South America. While definitive proof is elusive, the possibility of long-distance exchange only adds to the sense that Titicaca was a hub of interaction. To call it a sacred centre is not just to speak of ritual, but of networks that tied together disparate peoples through shared reverence. Yet not all of what divers have reported has been fully documented. Some mention statues larger than life, their forms resting half buried in silt, too heavy to retrieve. Others describe immense stone blocks aligned in ways that suggest roadways or platforms, structures that go far beyond small ritual shrines. These accounts raise difficult questions. If such things exist, why have they not been widely studied or displayed? Is it a matter of logistics, the immense cost and difficulty of excavation in such a hostile environment? Or is there a reluctance to reveal the full scope of what lies beneath, for fear of rewriting established narratives about the region's past? The lack of full disclosure fuels speculation. Stories circulate of divers encountering shapes that look like megalithic statues, their faces turned upward through the gloom. There are whispers of sunken roads that stretch farther than sonar surveys have mapped. Some believe the larger structures are being deliberately kept from public view, their significance too disruptive to the tidy timelines of Andean archaeology. Whether or not such claims are true, they highlight how much remains unseen, and how much we still don't know about what the lake guards in silence. Even the artifacts that have been studied leave mysteries. A gold ornament shaped like a feline, for example, seems tied to jaguar symbolism, more common in Amazonian cultures than in the high plateau. Its presence raises the question, was it a gift brought from afar, or evidence of deeper cultural exchange than we've yet recognized? Similarly, certain ceramics found underwater show styles that don't neatly fit into known traditions. They may represent transitional phases, experimental art, or even the remnants of cultures that have left no trace on land. Each piece complicates the story, reminding us that the Andes were never static, but a crossroads of ideas. What makes these finds powerful is the way they embody intent. None of them were lost casually. Gold could have been melted into jewellery, ceramics used for daily life, ornaments displayed in homes. Instead, they were surrendered to water. That act transforms them. They become more than objects, they become sacrifices, embodiments of belief. To hold one in your hand today is to touch the physical residue of devotion, an offering made in hope, fear, gratitude, or reverence. And then there are the accounts that still drift at the edges of official research. Fishermen tell of catching glimpses of stone walls through unusually clear water. Some describe hearing faint metallic sounds beneath the waves during storms, as though bells were ringing from churches that no longer stand. Whether these are legends, illusions, or echoes of real submerged structures, they remind us that Titicaca has never been just a body of water. It is a place where imagination and reality blend, where every ripple on the surface might conceal something waiting to be revealed. Taken together, the artifacts and the stories suggest that Lake Titicaca was never a marginal site. It was central, a pilgrimage centre, a trade hub, a sacred mirror of the cosmos. The offerings left there speak of communities willing to part with their most treasured possessions, not for material gain but for spiritual balance, and the discoveries we know of may represent only a fraction of what still rests beneath the silt. For now, the lake continues to guard its secrets. Each artifact recovered is a glimpse into devotion, a whisper of ceremony performed centuries ago. But the larger picture, the statues still buried, the possible roads unseen, the megaliths hinted at, remains obscured. Perhaps that is fitting. A mystery half revealed is a mystery still alive. Lake Titicaca is more than an archaeological site. It is a sacred archive, one that reminds us that the boundary between myth and history is often thinner than the shimmer of sunlight on water. By the time the discoveries of the early 2000s made their way into the news, most scholars placed the submerged terraces and temples of Lake Titicaca within the orbit of Tiwanaku. The dating, the style, the proximity, all pointed in that direction. But outside the academic world, a different conversation was unfolding. Writers, explorers, and alternative historians began to ask whether the story might be far older than anyone was willing to admit. Part of this comes from the sheer atmosphere of the lake itself. Standing at 12,500 feet above sea level, it feels timeless, removed from ordinary history. The water seems ancient in a way that invites speculation, and when myths speak of Viracocha rising from the lake after a great flood, or of earlier peoples destroyed and replaced, some see not just legend but memory, perhaps of cataclysms that happened long before Tiwanaku ever built its monuments. One theory suggests that the ruins beneath the lake could be more than 10,000 years old, dating back to the end of the last ice age. Around that time, glaciers were retreating, climates were shifting, and water levels all over the world were rising. If people lived along the shores of an earlier Titicaca, their temples might have been swallowed when melting ice poured into the basin. Supporters of this idea point to global parallels: submerged ruins in India's Gulf of Kambat, the mysterious structures at Yonaguni off Japan, and traditions of a lost golden age remembered in myths from Mesopotamia to the Americas. It's a bold suggestion. Mainstream archaeology is cautious about assigning such great antiquity to the Andes, yet the possibility lingers because of how much we still don't know. Very little of the lake has been explored systematically. The handful of sites surveyed hint at monumental architecture, but sonar shows other anomalies still unmapped. Without comprehensive excavation, the question of age remains open to interpretation. The figure of Viracocha adds fuel to the speculation. In myth, he is a bearded, pale-skinned man who emerged after a flood to bring knowledge and order to humanity. Some see him as a cultural memory of an ancient civilizing figure, perhaps a survivor of a global catastrophe, who travelled the world spreading skills of agriculture and architecture. To believers in lost civilizations, Viracocha looks like the Andean counterpart to other flood survivors. Figures like Noah, Utanapishtim, or even Plato's description of Atlanteans. Could the stories point to a shared memory of cataclysm carried across continents? Others look to the alignments of the ruins. At Tiwanaku itself, certain structures mark solstices with remarkable accuracy. If similar alignments existed in the now submerged temples, they might tell us when the complex was built, depending on how the stars and sun matched the structures at the time. Some researchers speculate that shifts in climate and even in the Earth's axis could place the origins of these temples far earlier than the conventional timeline suggests. Without direct study, it remains an open question. Then there is the issue of silence. Many alternative researchers note that while initial announcements about the finds in 2000 made headlines, detailed reports have been scarce since. Photos were released of small artifacts, but images of the larger temple structure are limited. Access to the lake for independent study is tightly controlled. This has led some to suspect that information is being withheld, not out of negligence but deliberately. If the ruins truly challenged the accepted chronology of Andean civilization, would institutions rush to publicize it, or quietly archive the evidence? Conspiracy or not, the absence of transparency creates a vacuum where speculation thrives. Books and documentaries began to suggest that Titicaca might be South America's Atlantis, a remnant of a civilization older than Sumer or Egypt. Some even proposed that survivors of such a lost world seeded later cultures across the globe, Tiwanaku and the Inca among them. Whether one accepts this or not, the lake has become a canvas for ideas about forgotten pasts, a place where imagination and archaeology meet. What keeps these ideas alive is not just the allure of the extraordinary, but the sense that Lake Titicaca still holds back more than it has revealed. Divers describe shapes they cannot explain, fishermen tell of walls glimpsed beneath the waves, and local traditions insist that whole cities rest on the lakebed. Against this backdrop, the suggestion that the ruins are far older than Tiwanaku feels less like fantasy and more like a possibility worth entertaining. The idea of a civilization far older than Tiwanaku is not without precedent in Andean lore. In local traditions, there are whispers of peoples who came before, builders so ancient their names have been forgotten. The Incas, when confronted with ruins they could not explain, often claimed they were made by the Puruma Auca, people of long ago. For them, the stones had simply always been there, relics of a time beyond memory. The sunken temples of Titicaca may have been absorbed into that same category, markers of a forgotten age erased by water. What makes these theories compelling is that they do not rely solely on myth. There are physical puzzles that remain unresolved. The sheer size of the temple foundation mapped in 2000, nearly 200 meters in length, suggests a scale of planning unusual for small early communities. The precision of stonework seen at Tiwanaku and Pumapunku is difficult to explain with the simple copper tools believed to be available at the time. If the sunken ruins share these characteristics, they might represent knowledge that reached back further than we expect. Some alternative researchers link this to broader patterns. They argue that many megalithic sites around the world, from Baalbek in Lebanon to the pyramids of Egypt, show a sudden leap in engineering skill, as though knowledge arrived fully formed rather than gradually evolving. In this view, Lake Titicaca's drowned temples may be part of a global story of a lost high civilization, one that flourished during the Ice Age and left behind scattered traces. The Andes, remote and difficult to access, could have preserved a chapter of that story under its waters. Skeptics counter that such claims underestimate the ingenuity of ancient peoples. They point out that experimentation, collaboration, and long-term cultural development can explain even the most daunting constructions. But even among mainstream scholars, questions linger. Why do so many flood myths from distant cultures resemble each other? Why do submerged ruins appear in lakes and coastlines around the world? And why, after more than 2 decades, have the full details of the Titicaca expedition remained sparse? It is this last point that fuels whispers of suppression. According to some accounts, artifacts brought up from the lake were quietly stored in museums, rarely displayed. Reports of larger statues or megalithic blocks have not been followed up with public studies. Funding for further exploration has been limited, despite the significance of the initial discoveries. To those who suspect a cover-up, this looks like deliberate neglect. They argue that acknowledging the full scale of the ruins could force a rewriting of the timeline of South American civilization, a shift some institutions might prefer to avoid. Whether or not one accepts this idea, there is no denying that the lake resists easy explanation. Even with modern technology, visibility underwater is poor, and only a fraction of the lake has been surveyed. Sonar images hint at anomalies yet to be investigated. Local divers speak of features that have never appeared in official publications. In this sense, Titicaca remains a frontier, a place where knowledge is partial, and mystery still holds the upper hand. Speculation goes even further in some circles. A few researchers propose that the ruins align with astronomical markers, not of the current sky, but of epochs thousands of years earlier. If true, that would suggest construction dates reaching into deep prehistory. Others link Viracocha's mythic journey, rising from the lake and travelling the world to teach humanity, with the global appearance of civilizing figures who share similar traits. In this light, Viracocha becomes more than an Andean god. He becomes a piece of a larger puzzle, a memory of ancient teachers who may have walked the earth after a great flood. For mainstream science, these are flights of imagination, but even within cautious research, the sense of the unknown persists. We know there were fluctuations in the lake's level, we know there are structures underwater, and we know the myths preserve memories of catastrophe. The question of how old those structures are remains unanswered. Without definitive dating, the door is open, not to certainty but to wonder. And perhaps that is the essence of the forbidden theories surrounding Titicaca. They thrive in the space left by silence. When evidence is partial, imagination steps in. When reports are limited, speculation grows. Some of it may be exaggerated, some may be wrong. But within the weave of myth, archaeology, and possibility, there may also be truths waiting to surface. The lake itself seems to invite such thoughts. Its waters are opaque, its depths cold and silent, its surface reflecting the sky so perfectly that standing on the shore feels like standing at the edge of two worlds. Beneath that mirror lies stone, and beneath the stone lies meaning. Whether the ruins are 1,000 years old or 10,000, whether they were built by Tiwanaku masons or by peoples forgotten to history, they remain a reminder that human civilization has always been more complex, more layered, and more mysterious than we assume. And so the forbidden theories endure. Some imagine Atlantis in the Andes, others a lost golden age wiped away by floods, others still a civilization of teachers who gave birth to the cultures we now study. The truth may be simpler or stranger than any of these. For now, Lake Titicaca keeps its secrets. What lies beneath is not just archaeology, but possibility, waiting for the courage, or the permission, to be revealed. For centuries after the fall of the Inca Empire, Lake Titicaca never lost its status as sacred ground. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century, they quickly realized that the lake was more than geography to the people of the Andes, it was identity. Chroniclers like Pedro Chiesa de Leon wrote of pilgrimages to its islands, of temples glittering with gold, and of ceremonies that endured even under the shadow of conquest. The Spanish dismantled shrines, melted idols and planted crosses, but the sanctity of the lake itself could not be erased. On the Isla del Sol, where the Inca once honoured the birth of the sun, colonial missionaries built churches over sacred sites, attempting to overwrite old beliefs with new ones. Yet the memory of the place persisted. Pilgrims continued to visit in secret, sometimes blending Christian and Andean traditions, carrying offerings not to saints, but to the waters that had always been alive. In this way, the lake became a quiet site of resistance. Beneath the gaze of foreign rule, it remained what it had always been, a portal between worlds. That continuity is still visible today. Among the Aymara and Quechua people who live along its shores, Lake Titicaca is treated not only as a natural resource, but as a living being. In villages near Puno and Copacabana, ceremonies are held each year to bless the waters. Coca leaves are offered, chicha beer poured onto the ground, and incense burned in clay vessels, echoes of rituals that stretch back thousands of years. Fishermen sprinkle alcohol into the waves before setting their nets, acknowledging the spirit of the lake. Farmers invoke it during planting and harvest, believing its power extends into the soil. The most visible of these traditions is the Feast of the Virgen de la Candelaria in Puno, a Catholic festival infused with older Andean roots. Dancers in elaborate costumes fill the streets, music and drums echo late into the night, and offerings are made both to the Virgin and to Pachamama, Mother Earth. The blending of saints and spirits reflects how the lake has absorbed centuries of change without losing its essence. Beneath the Christian imagery, the devotion to Titicaca and its divine presence remains intact. One of the most remarkable survivals is the tradition of the totara reed boats. For thousands of years, people have built boats from the reeds that grow thick along the shore, bundling them into elegant crescent shapes. The Uros people, who live on floating islands made of these reeds, continue to craft them as their ancestors did. To step onto one is to step into living archaeology. These boats are not just practical, they are ceremonial, often used in rituals where offerings are carried onto the lake. When gold figurines and ceramics were lowered into the depth centuries ago, it was likely from boats much like these. The Uros themselves represent continuity with the ancient world. According to their own oral traditions, they are the people of the water, descended from those who first lived upon the lake before the rise of great empires. Today they maintain floating villages where homes, pathways and even watchtowers are built from reeds. Life there is precarious. The islands must be constantly renewed. Yet it endures as a testimony to adaptation and resilience. Visitors sometimes dismiss them as curiosities for tourists, but in truth, they are the living descendants of cultures that treated Titicaca as home and temple alike. In the Bolivian town of Copacabana on the opposite shore, another layer of continuity can be seen. Here stands the Basilica of Our Lady of Copacabana, built in the 16th century. The statue of the Virgin housed within is said to have miraculous powers, drawing pilgrims from across the Andes. Yet the site was sacred long before the church. It was once a center for Inca worship, a place where offerings were made to the lake. To Andean pilgrims, the Virgin is less a replacement than a new mask for the same eternal presence. The shrine remains a nexus where Christian devotion and ancient reverence intertwine, each sustaining the other. Spanish chronicles record their astonishment at the wealth once devoted to these waters. Garcilaso de la Vega, the mestizo historian, wrote of Inca priests journeying to the islands with offerings of gold, silver, and precious textiles. He described ceremonies where flames danced on platforms and sacrifices were made to honor the rising sun. To the Spanish, this was pagan superstition. To the people of the Andes, it was acknowledgement of a truth that could not be conquered, that the lake was alive, its power both benevolent and dangerous. The persistence of these beliefs, across conquest and colonization, shows how deeply the lake is embedded in identity. Even when temples were razed and treasures carried off to Europe, the myths endured in the voices of the people, Viracocha rising from the waters, Manco Capac and Mama Oclo emerging to found Cusco, floods sent to erase and renew. These stories survived because the lake itself remained, impossible to silence. Its very presence was testimony, and no empire could remove it. Today, archaeologists and locals alike treat Titicaca as an archive, though in different ways. Researchers see layers of sediment, terraces, and ruins. Communities see the continuity of spirit, the unbroken line of offerings from ancestors to the present day. Both views intersect in the objects pulled from the lake, artifacts that are at once historical data and sacred relics. Each gold figurine, each sealed stone box, is a bridge across time. They link modern rituals with ancient ones, showing that while empires have risen and fallen, the relationship with the lake has remained constant. This makes Titicaca not just a site of lost ruins, but a living tradition. Unlike Atlantis or other sunken worlds remembered only in story, the sacredness of this lake has never vanished. It has adapted, transformed, merged with new religions, and yet endured. In that sense, it is not only a cradle of forgotten civilizations, but also of civilizations remembered, carried forward by those who continue to live on its shores. To understand Lake Titicaca fully, it helps to place it alongside other sacred landscapes of the ancient world. Human beings, across continents, have always chosen special places to anchor their cosmologies. In Anatolia, at Göbekli Tepe, hunter-gatherers carved massive stone pillars over 11,000 years ago, aligning them with celestial patterns. In Britain, Stonehenge rose on Salisbury Plain as a circle of megaliths that track the sun's journey through the year. In Japan, the submerged structures off Yonaguni's coast stir debate about whether they are natural or crafted, but either way they testify to the deep connection between stone, sea, and meaning. Lake Titicaca belongs in this company. Like those sites, it represents the human urge to build meaning into the land, or in this case, into the water. But unlike Göbekli Tepe or Stonehenge, Titicaca's temples are not easily visited. They are hidden, submerged, glimpsed only by divers or sonar. This concealment adds to their power. They are not monuments you walk through in daylight. They are presences you sense beneath the rippling surface, reminding you that history often lies just out of sight. The global pattern is clear. Civilizations old and new chose to invest their greatest energies not in ordinary settlements, but in sacred spaces. The sheer labour that went into building terraces on mountain slopes, aligning stones with stars, or lowering offerings into lakes speaks of a universal truth. That meaning mattered as much as survival. To plant crops fed the body, but to honour the gods fed the soul. At Titicaca, the two were inseparable. The raised fields around the lake show agricultural genius, while the offerings in the water show devotion. Together they reveal a worldview in which the practical and the spiritual were threads of the same fabric. What makes Titicaca especially compelling is the way it challenges our timelines. If the submerged temples belong to Tiwanaku, then they push back the sophistication of Andean civilization by centuries. If they predate Tiwanaku, they suggest an even earlier tradition of monumental building. And if, as some alternative theories propose, they are more than 10,000 years old, then they join Göbekli Tepe as evidence that humanity's first great monuments were not late achievements but early ones. born from a need to root meaning in the earth even before cities or empires fully formed. In this sense, the lake is not just a local mystery, it is part of a global question. How old is civilization really? We tend to think of progress as linear. First villages, then cities, then monumental architecture. But places like Titicaca complicate that story. They suggest cycles, where great achievements may have risen, been lost, and then risen again. Floods may have erased temples, but not the memory of building them. Empires may have fallen, but not the urge to align stone with sky. Each resurgence hints that human creativity is older, deeper, and more resilient than our timelines allow. The comparisons extend beyond archaeology. Flood myths are nearly universal. From Mesopotamia's Gilgamesh to the Mayas' tales of worlds destroyed, from the biblical deluge to the legends of Viracocha, water is remembered as both destroyer and renewer. At Lake Titicaca, this convergence of myth and geology is unusually vivid. The sediment cores tell of sudden rises in water, the legends speak of floods sent by gods, and the ruins themselves rest beneath the waves. Few places bring together physical evidence and oral tradition so seamlessly. Modern science approaches the lake cautiously, mapping, sampling, measuring. Local traditions approach it differently, with offerings and prayers. Both perspectives reveal parts of the truth. The scientist sees climate shifts, tectonic movement, and cultural adaptation. The villager sees a sacred being demanding respect. When combined, the two give us a fuller picture. Titicaca is not just geology or myth, not just archaeology or ritual. It is all of these at once, a reminder that human meaning-making cannot be disentangled from the landscapes that shape it. And what of the larger mysteries? The statues said to rest on the lakebed, the roads glimpsed by divers, the artifacts still unpublished. These remain in shadow, their details elusive. Perhaps they will one day surface, confirming or reshaping what we believe, or perhaps they will remain hidden, part of the lake's quiet guardianship of its past. Either way, their possibility keeps the story alive. Uncertainty is not absence, it is invitation. When we think of forgotten civilizations, we often imagine them gone beyond recall, their memory scattered like dust. But Lake Titicaca shows another possibility. Here, the past is not erased but submerged, still present, still whispering. The offerings beneath the water are not just relics, they are ongoing conversations, messages that continue to speak across centuries. The people who live along the lake today, with their reed boats, their festivals and their prayers, are part of that same story. The civilization may have changed, but the relationship endures. And that brings us to the quiet reflection that closes this journey. Lake Titicaca is not Atlantis. It is not a puzzle to be solved once and for all. It is something richer, a living archive of human imagination, devotion, and resilience. It reminds us that history is not a line marching forward, but a fabric woven with threads of memory, myth, and stone. It shows us that the sacred is not hidden in distant heavens, but present in the landscapes we inhabit, if only we know how to see. Beneath the waters of Lake Titicaca, secrets still wait, silent, patient, and powerful enough to change everything we think we know about our past. Thanks for watching.